Jace was running, but his legs were weak and bleeding. The trees around him were tall and glowing with strange colors. The forest floor was wet and cold under his hands. As he crawled through the thick alien plants, he had no weapon left, and his suit was torn and burning at the edges. Smoke came from the crash site behind him, and he could still hear the explosions in the distance. His ship had been shot down, and his team was gone. He was alone on a planet he did not recognize. His breath came fast and painful as blood dripped from a long wound on his side. He had no idea how far he had come or where he was going. All he knew was that something was following him. He looked behind but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched did not leave. He tried to stand, but his body gave up. He fell again on his stomach and gasped for air. The forest was silent, now too silent. No birds, no wind, no voices, only the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. Then he heard a soft step, then another. Something was moving toward him through the trees. He reached for a sharp rock, but his hand was shaking too much. He could not fight, not anymore. Shadow appeared near the edge of the clearing. At first he thought it was another hunter drone, but it was not metal. It was soft and graceful. A figure stepped into the faint light glowing from the forest plants. She was small and thin, her skin a soft violet color with glowing marks on her arms and neck. Her long silver hair flowed behind her, and her wide blue eyes looked at him with something between fear and wonder. She looked young, but there was something deep in her eyes, like she had seen too much. Jace tried to speak, but only a groan came out. He lifted one hand weakly, but then dropped it. He expected her to run, or maybe finish him. Instead, she walked slowly to him and knelt beside his head. She tilted her head and touched his face gently, like she was checking if he was real. Her fingers were warm and soft, and her touch careful. She looked into his eyes, and for a moment, time stopped. Then she leaned close and spoke. Her voice was soft, and her words were strange, but the tone was gentle. He could not understand her language, but something in his chest stirred. She placed her hand over his wound and pressed gently. He flinched, but then felt a strange warmth spreading through his side. A glowing plant in her pouch lit up as she pressed it into the wound. It stung, but it also stopped the bleeding. She worked in silence, moving fast but carefully. Jace could barely stay awake, but he watched her face. She was beautiful, but not just in the way her face looked. There was something peaceful about her, even though she seemed scared. After some time, she leaned close again and whispered something into his ear. This time her words were slow and clear. "You are the one from my dreams," she said. Jace thought he was hearing things. He blinked, but her face was still there, her lips still moving. "I saw you long ago," she said again. He wanted to ask more, but darkness pulled him down. Her voice was the last thing he heard before his eyes closed. She stayed beside him, her hand still on his chest. Outside in the woods, a pair of red lights blinked through the trees, watching and waiting, but they did not attack. Not yet. The girl looked up toward the forest and narrowed her eyes. She knew they would come. She looked back at the human lying weak beside her. She had found him just in time, but saving him might cost everything. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a small device. It blinked once and then made a low sound. She checked his pulse again and touched her forehead to his. She whispered again, this time in her own tongue. "Please don't die, not now, not after. I finally found you." Then she stood slowly and with effort began to lift him. She wrapped one of his arms over her shoulder and began to pull him away into the deeper woods. Her steps were slow and heavy, but steady. The glowing moss lit the path. As she walked behind them, the blood trail began to fade ahead of them. The forest grew darker and colder, but she did not stop. She had waited too long for this moment. She would not let him go now. Kari pulled the human through the thick undergrowth, her feet sinking into the soft moss with every step. His body was heavy and cold, but she kept going, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The hidden path twisted between old tree roots and glowing vines. Above them, strange birds watched in silence, their eyes following her with curiosity. The human's blood left a thin trail behind them, but she did not stop to hide it. Time was not on her side. She had seen the red lights watching from the woods. The hunters were near, and they would not wait. Forever she reached a mound covered in thick green ferns. With one hand she brushed them aside, revealing a small circular door made of carved bark and glowing stones. She whispered a command in her native tongue, and the door opened with a soft hum. Inside it was warm and dim. The walls were smooth and alive, pulsing gently with light. This place was older than her village, older than memory. It had been hidden long ago by those who had magic in their hands and stars in their eyes. She dragged the human inside and sealed the door. Only then did she let herself fall to her knees. Her hands shook as she checked his pulse, still there but weak. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow. She reached for the glowing root vine hanging from the wall. She squeezed the sap into her hand and pressed it against his wound. He groaned and turned his head. His eyes fluttered open for a second, and he looked at her, then closed again. Carrie whispered softly calming words as she cleaned the blood from his chest. Her fingers moved carefully, tracing the lines of his scars. She had never seen a human before, only the images in her dreams. She remembered them clearly, the visions of him standing in fire and water, reaching out his hand to her. She had thought them just dreams until now. She placed a soft leaf over his forehead and sat beside him. She listened to the sound of his breathing. The room was quiet, only the low hum of the roots and the slow drip of water echoed in the shelter outside. The wind picked up and the trees began to shake. The forest was warning her. The hunters were coming. She stood and moved to the far wall where she kept her supplies. She pulled out a long blade made of stone and bone. She checked the traps she had set earlier near the entrance. Each one was ready, sharpened, and hidden under soft leaves. She lit a small fire in the center of the room, using dust from her pouch, and the flame danced quietly. The human stirred again and opened his eyes wider. This time he looked around, confused and afraid. Kari moved closer and placed her hand on his arm. He tried to sit up but winced in pain. She spoke gently in slow words. "Safe, you are safe." His eyes focused on her face. He tried to speak but his throat was dry. She offered him water in a bowl carved from crystal bark. He drank slowly and looked at her with questioning eyes. She pointed to herself and said, "Kari," then pointed to him. "You." He hesitated, then whispered, "Jace." She smiled. Jace. The name felt familiar, like a word carried by the wind. They sat in silence for a while. Then Jace pointed to his chest where the wound was. He mouthed the word. Why? Kari looked down, then up again, her voice quiet. "Dreams." She touched her head, then her heart. "Saw you in dreams." Jace looked confused but said nothing. He tried to stand again, and she helped him. He limped slowly around the small room, looking at the glowing walls and strange symbols. He stopped at one carved stone and traced the lines with his fingers. He did not know the meaning, but something felt right, like he had seen this before. Kari watched him with a careful eye. There was more to him than she had thought, more than just a soldier or a human, something deeper. She helped him lie down again and covered him with a warm pelt made from forest beast fur. He looked at her and said, "Thank you." She did not understand all his words, but his tone was enough. She nodded and sat beside him again. Outside the wind grew louder and the trees groaned far in the woods. The red lights blinked again. The hunters had found the trail, but the shelter was hidden by old magic and deeper roots. They would not find them. Not yet. Kari looked down at Jace and whispered to herself, "I found you. Now I must protect you, even if it costs me everything." The days passed slowly inside the hidden shelter as Jace healed under the care of the strange but gentle alien girl, Kari. He could not understand her words, but he understood her actions. She brought him warm roots to eat and glowing fruit to drink. She used soft hands to clean his wounds and smooth voice to calm his restless sleep. He watched her move with grace through the small space lit by the soft pulsing walls that seemed alive. Even when she said nothing, her eyes spoke. They carried pain but also hope. Jace tried to speak, but her language was made of breathy syllables and flowing sounds he could not copy. So they began to build their own way to speak. He tapped his hand twice to ask for water. She drew a small spiral in the air to say danger. He smiled when she smiled and frowned when she did. They learned each other in silence. Hikari showed him how to touch the roots to feel their hum. She pressed his hand to the wall where old marks glowed under his fingers. She pointed at the lines and then touched his heart. Jace did not know the meaning, but he felt something stir, like a memory forgotten. At night she would sit near the door with her blade in her lap. Jace would lie still watching her figure glowing in the firelight. She never slept fully, always listening to the woods outside. He asked with his eyes once why she did not rest. She drew a sharp line across her palm with her finger, then pointed to the door. He understood danger never sleeps. So one evening a sound came from above, a faint whir like a machine. Kari rushed to Jace and pulled him to the side wall. She pressed a stone and a panel opened. Inside was a small space filled with plant growth and soft moss. She pushed him in and covered the entrance. He stayed quiet, breathing slow through the cracks. He saw her stand tall and hold her blade ready. The ceiling shimmered slightly, then a small drone floated down through the roots. It looked like a silver eye spinning and blinking with blue lights. Kari stepped forward and held her hand up. The drone scanned her. Jace saw her body tense. Suddenly her hand glowed with soft green light. She whispered something, and the glow spread to her eyes. The drone blinked, then sparked. It shook once, then fell to the floor. Like a broken toy, smoke curled from its shell. Kari dropped to her knees, breathing hard. Jace crawled out and held her as she swayed. She looked up and placed her hand over his, her voice weak but calm. Safe. Jace nodded but felt the fear rise in his chest. They had been found. He looked at the broken drone and saw a symbol. It belonged to the Threxian command. He remembered them from the battlefield. They were ruthless. Kari stood slowly and walked to the fire. She dropped a few leaves into the flame and it turned blue. She looked at Jace with sad eyes. He pointed at the drone, then at her. "You." Why? She sat beside him and reached for his hand. She placed it over her chest. Her heart beat strong and fast. Then she pointed to the drone and drew two lines in the air crossing each other. She drew a small shape, then a larger one beside it, then touched his chest again. Jace tried to understand. She was part of them, but not like them. He leaned back and thought of the battle that brought him here, the ambush, the burning trees, the sky filled with fire. He had seen something in the chaos, a flash of green like her glow. Had she been there before? Kari walked to the wall and pressed a symbol. A map appeared glowing softly in the air. It showed the forest and a red dot moving toward them. She pointed to it, then to the broken drone. Then she drew a circle around their shelter. They had time, but not much. Jace touched her shoulder. He pointed to himself, then to her. Fight. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Together she handed him a thin blade made of bone and crystal. It felt light but sharp. He tested it in his hand. Kari smiled faintly. For the first time they were not just survivor and healer. They were now a team. As the red dot moved closer on the glowing map, Kari and Jace sat beside the fire and began to plan. They spoke no words, but their eyes said enough. Asterisk. The red dot on the map moved closer as the wind outside the shelter howled through the trees. Kari stood over the fire, grinding dark seeds into a thick paste, while Jace tied sharp stones to sticks with glowing vine thread. They had no words, but they shared one purpose: to protect the shelter and to protect each other. Kari moved quickly, placing small crystal stones into carved holes along the tunnel leading out. Each one hummed with a low pulse, waiting for a trigger. Jace watched her work and learned her steps outside the forest began to shift. The birds stopped singing. The light from the moss dimmed as if hiding itself. Jace tightened his grip on the blade Kari had given him. His heart beat fast, but his hand stayed steady. Kari placed her hand on his chest and nodded once. Then she moved to the entrance and pressed her back to the wall. The tunnel filled with silence until the first sound came: metal feet, marching in slow, steady steps. 3 shadows appeared. Armored Threxians, tall and broad, with red eyes glowing behind their masks. Their rifles buzzed with cold energy. One of them stepped on the first trigger stone. A flash of green light exploded from the floor, sending him flying into the wall. The second soldier turned, but Kari was already moving. She slid across the ground and struck low. Her blade cut under his armor. Where metal met flesh, he roared in pain. As his weapon fell, Jace charged at the third one, swinging the bone blade with both hands. It cut across the mask, shattering one red eye. The Threxian grabbed Jace and slammed him into the wall. Kari screamed and rushed to him, but Jace twisted free and stabbed upward. The bone blade sank into the soft part of the alien's neck. The Threxian fell with a heavy thud. Jace breathed hard blood on his face, and arm-shaking Kari ran to him and checked his wounds. He was bruised but alive. She looked at the three bodies on the ground, and her hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper. She had taken life again, even to protect someone that still hurt. Jace placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked into his eyes and found strength there. Suddenly one of the soldiers coughed. He was still alive. Kari rushed to him and knelt beside his broken armor. She spoke fast in her own language. The soldier's eyes widened in surprise. He looked at Jace, then back at her. He tried to speak, but blood filled his throat. Still he managed to say one word before he died. Hybridges heard it and looked at Kari. She backed away and sat on the floor. She held her hands tightly, as if afraid of her own skin. Jace knelt in front of her and touched her arm. She did not pull away. He pointed to her, then to the dead Threxian, then to himself. She nodded slowly. She stood and walked to the back wall where she kept a sealed pouch. She opened it and pulled out a small disc. She placed it in the firelight, and it activated a recording, played voices in Threxian tongue, mixed with human words. Jace listened as an image appeared above the fire. A lab, a young girl inside a pod DN, scans flashing across screens, his own face among the data. He stared in silence as the truth formed. Kari had not only seen him in dreams, she had been made using part of him. A hybrid, half Threxian, half human. His DN had been stolen during a past battle, used to create something meant to destroy. But she had escaped the lab and hidden in the forest. Kari looked ashamed, but Jace did not move away. He sat beside her and took her hand. She looked at him surprised. He pointed to her chest and said Kari, then to his own Jace. Then he touched her hand again. Together, she wiped her eyes and smiled for the first time in days. The shelter was quiet again. The danger for now was gone, but they both knew it would return outside. In the dark woods, more red eyes blinked in the shadows. Patrol was only the beginning. Now they would come in full force. Kari stood and looked toward the door. Jace joined her and nodded. They had a new fight ahead, but they also had something the enemy did not hope. The night was cold, and the shelter walls pulsed with a slow blue light. As Jace lay awake staring at the ceiling, Kari was sitting near the fire, her eyes distant, her hands resting in her lap. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not empty but full of questions they were afraid to ask. Jace closed his eyes, but instead of sleep, he saw flashes of light and metal and screaming voices. He saw a lab, a white room, wires in his skin, and cold machines buzzing around him. He saw a young girl in a pod floating with eyes closed, hair like silver threads drifting in water. He opened his eyes and sat up, his heart beating faster. Kari turned to look at him and tilted her head. He pointed to his temple, then drew the shape of the pod in the air. She nodded slowly and walked to the back wall where the disc still lay beside the fire. She activated it again, and the images returned. This time Jace stood and walked closer, watching every frame. The lab was Threxian, but parts of it were human. The machine scanned DNA and compared it with his. He saw soldiers in black armor talking about weapons. Then he saw her carrying much younger floating in the pod. A voice said she was Subject 13, half Threxian, half human, designed to adapt to both worlds and destroy both if needed. The screen changed to another file. Jace saw his own face captured from a battle 3 years ago. He remembered now he had been taken by Threxians after his ship exploded. He had escaped days later, but he never knew what they had taken from him. Now he understood they used his blood, his cells, to build her. Kari turned off the disc and looked at him, her face full of guilt. She placed her hand on her chest, then pointed to him, then shook her head. Not your choice, not your fault. Jace walked to her and touched her hand. He shook his head and smiled weakly. Not angry, just surprised. He pointed to her heart. then made a small sun shape with his fingers. "Good," she smiled back and touched his forehead. "Dream you." Jace sat beside her and stared into the fire. The warmth touched his face, but not the fear inside. Was connected to her in a way deeper than blood. She was part of him, yet completely herself. She had made her own path in the forest alone. Hunted and hiding, she had saved him not once but many times. And still she smiled. Kari stood and walked to the tunnel where the trap had been. She picked up the broken Threxian rifle and examined it. She pulled out a small energy cell and brought it to Jace. He nodded and opened his toolkit. They worked together, quietly building something new, not a weapon, but a signal. A beacon. Jace knew help might be out there. A human patrol, a listening satellite, maybe even an old friend he had to try. They placed the beacon outside, hidden in a hollow tree covered with moss. Kari whispered to the roots and the tree closed around it, sealing it from sight. That night Jace had another dream. This time he was in the lab again, but the pod opened and Kari stepped out. She reached for him and said, "I choose my own way." He woke up breathing hard. Kari was beside him holding his hand. She looked at him with calm eyes and nodded once. He squeezed her hand and smiled. They spent the day preparing. Jace fixed a sensor that could track movement in the forest. Kari set traps deeper into the trees with vines that could bind and confuse. They were not waiting anymore. They were ready at sunset. The sky turned red and gold. Kari sat on a rock near the entrance, her hair shining in the light. Jace sat beside her and they watched the horizon together. She pointed to the stars and said, "Home." He looked at her and asked, "Yours?" She shook her head and pointed to her heart. "Here." Then to him, "With you." Jace looked away for a moment, then said softly, "Mine too." They sat in silence as the wind moved through the leaves. The forest no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a choice, like freedom somewhere beyond the trees. The enemy still waited, but now Jace knew who he was and Kari knew who she wanted to be. They were no longer afraid. They were no longer alone. The beacon hidden inside the tree blinked a soft blue pulse every few seconds, waiting for someone somewhere to notice. Kari and Jace sat close to the fire inside the shelter, their bodies tired, but their minds sharp. Kari touched the wall gently, and the roots responded, opening a small panel where she had stored a few old crystals. She held one to the light, and it glowed faintly, the power almost gone. Jace watched her work, his hands resting on the bone blade she had given him. He knew the enemy would return, not in threes, but in full force this time. That morning the sensor made from Threxian tech buzzed once, then again, then louder. They were coming. Kari and Jace looked at each other and said nothing. They didn't need words now. They moved through the trees, setting new traps and marking safe paths. Kari climbed the tallest root structure and looked out across the forest. Black smoke was rising in the distance. It was not from fire, it was from machines, war machines. Found a spot with high ground and soft moss, perfect for a last stand. They dug shallow pits and covered them with leaves, hiding sharpened stakes inside. Kari carved symbols into the bark of trees and whispered chants in her tongue. The roots responded, slowly shifting like living things, obeying an old friend. The forest was alive, and now it was watching. By the time the sun faded behind the hills, the air had turned cold. The first sound came, metal legs stomping through the brush, then voices, rough deep tones of Threxian soldiers moving in formation. Jace pressed his back to the tree and weighted his fingers tight around the bone blade. Kari stood across from him, her eyes glowing with soft green light. She was ready. The enemy entered the trap zone unaware. The first soldier stepped into a vine loop and was yanked into the air. A second turned just as a pit opened under him. Screams filled the forest, but they did not last long. Then silence again. A commander appeared, taller than the others, with armor that shimmered like oil. He raised his hand and the soldiers spread out in a line. Kari stepped into view and raised her arms. The commander froze. His voice came out like stone cracking. "Subject 13." Kari did not flinch. She spoke back in Threxian. "I am not your weapon. You are broken code." He replied, "Return now or be erased." Jace moved beside her and raised the rifle he had built from The broken parts he fired and one soldier fell. Then the forest moved. Kari's symbols came to life, glowing across the tree trunks. Roots burst from the ground, grabbing legs and twisting armor. Jace ran forward, swinging the blade, cutting wires. And arms as metal screamed. The battle was fast and wild. Kari's light shone like a fire in the dark. She moved through the enemy like wind, sharp and silent. But the commander was stronger. He broke free of the roots and rushed toward her with a spear of energy. She blocked it, but was thrown back, hitting the ground hard. Jace saw her fall and ran to her side. The commander raised the spear again. Jace threw the bone blade with all his strength. It struck the commander's neck and sparks flew. He staggered but did not fall. Kari rose behind him, her hands glowing brighter than ever. She touched his back and whispered something ancient. His armor shattered and he dropped to his knees, then fell. Silence returned to the forest. Jace fell too. The ground breathing heavy, his arm bleeding. Kari knelt beside him, her body shaking. He looked at her and smiled weakly. "We did it." She nodded, but her face was pale. He noticed the cut on her side, deep and glowing with strange red light. She tried to hide it, but her breath was unsteady. He held her close and whispered, "Stay with me." She smiled and touched his face. "Found you." Her eyes closed slowly as her light dimmed. Jace held her tighter, refusing to let go. He looked up at the sky, the beacon. Maybe it worked. A sudden sound above engines. Blue light flashed through the treetops. A ship broke through the clouds and hovered low. A human patrol ship. Ropes dropped, voices called out. They had seen the signal. They had come. Jace waved one arm and pointed to Kari. The medics ran and began their work. He stepped back as they placed her on a floating stretcher. She opened her eyes once and reached for him. He grabbed her hand and whispered, "I am here." She smiled always. The ship flew above the glowing forest, carrying Kari and Jace away from the battlefield below. The human medics worked fast around her, soft voices and steady hands moving over her wound. Jace sat beside her, watching every breath she took. His fingers locked around hers, refusing to let go. The lights of the ship flickered over her face, making her look almost like a dream again. She was pale but alive. That was all that mattered now. The ship docked at a large floating station above the planet, where human soldiers moved with precision and order. Jace stepped out, holding Kari's stretcher as they moved her to the medical bay. Some of the crew stared, unsure what to think of the violet-skinned girl with glowing eyes. One soldier reached for his weapon, but the commander raised a hand and said, "Stand down. She saved one of our own inside." The medical bay machines hummed and screens lit up with her vital signs. Jace stood by her side as the doctors scanned her body. They whispered among themselves words like hybrid, enhanced energy core, unknown biology. Jace did not care about the words. He only watched her eyes, waiting for them to open again. Hours passed and the ship grew quiet. The stars outside moved slowly as the station orbited the alien planet. Jace sat with his head in his hands when a soft sound made him look up. Kari opened her eyes. She looked around, confused, then found him and smiled weakly. He rushed to her and held her hand again. She moved her lips slowly and said, "You are safe." He laughed softly and nodded. "Because of you." She looked at the ceiling, then back at him. "Am I still me?" He leaned closer and whispered, "You are more than ever." The commander entered the room and stood at the foot of her bed. He looked at Kari with cautious eyes, then at Jace. "Tell me why she is not a threat." Jace stood tall, his voice calm but strong. "Because she chose us over them. Because she saved me. Because she saved all of you." Commander looked at Kari again and then sighed. "We have orders to transport her to Central Command for study." Jace stepped forward. "She is not a sample. She is not your prisoner. She is a person." Kari spoke softly. "Let me speak for myself." She sat up slowly and looked at the commander. "I was made to destroy, but I chose to protect. If that makes me a threat, then so be it." The commander nodded slowly. "Then prove it. Help us." She looked at Jace, who nodded without hesitation. Together, over the next few days, Kari walked the halls of the station with Jace by her side. She helped the engineers understand Threxian tech. She taught the scientists how to grow healing moss in clean chambers. She trained soldiers to fight with forest skill and silent steps. She became more than an outsider. She became part of them. Some still feared her, but more began to respect her stories, spread of how she fought alone, how she saved the human soldier, how she turned against her own kind one night. Jason Curry stood on the observation deck watching the stars. She leaned on the railing, her silver hair catching the light. He stood beside her silent for a while, then said, "Do you ever wonder why you dreamed of me?" She smiled and looked at him. Maybe the stars were whispering. He turned to her and said, "What did you whisper to me that day in the forest?" The first words. She looked down then, into his eyes. "You are the one I saw you before. In my dreams I was always running, and you were always waiting." Jace reached for her hand and held it tightly. "You are not alone anymore." She nodded. Neither are youth. Station lights dimmed, and the stars outside blinked like tiny promises. Jace and Kari stood together, not as soldier and hybrid, not as human and alien, but as something new, something stronger. A message came from Earth Command. A new mission was forming, a human-Threxian alliance, a chance for peace. And at the center of it was their story. Jace looked at her and smiled, ready for another adventure. Kari smiled back. As long as I'm with you, their story would become legend, told not just as a tale of survival, but as the moment when a human and an alien chose to believe in something more. All because one girl whispered words that changed everything.